The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass immediately. This passenger is claiming you're in her assigned seat." Karen's face went from smug confidence to panic in about 2 seconds flat as she frantically dug through her designer purse. Meanwhile, I was sitting comfortably in seat 6 of her seat with my boarding pass clearly showing 14C, watching the most beautiful case of airplane karma unfold right before my eyes. I know I have it somewhere," Karen stammered, her voice getting higher with each word. This woman is obviously confused about her seat assignment. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known when she shoved past me in the boarding line 30 minutes earlier, was that I had been watching her every move since the gate. I knew exactly which seat was hers. And I knew exactly how to make her regret every rude, entitled moment of her behavior. The best part? She was about to be escorted off the plane in front of everyone who had witnessed her cutting in line and acting like she owned the airport. But let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name is Robert Martinez, and at 64, I've learned that patience is indeed a virtue, but sometimes, people mistake your patience for being a pushover. After 38 years as a high school principal, I thought I'd dealt with every type of entitled behavior imaginable. Turns out, airports bring out a special breed of rudeness that even teenagers can't match. I was flying from Phoenix to Portland on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. My wife Patricia had passed away 8 months earlier after 42 years of marriage, and this was my first solo trip since her funeral. Our daughter Lisa lived in Portland with her family, and she'd been gently encouraging me to visit more often. "Dad, the kids miss their grandpa," she'd said during our last phone call. "And honestly, I think you need to get out of that house for a while." She was right, of course. The house felt too big and too quiet without Patricia's laughter filling the rooms. But traveling alone at my age wasn't something I was looking forward to. Patricia had always handled the logistics. She'd print the boarding passes, keep track of gate changes, make sure we had everything we needed. Now, at 64, I was figuring out how to navigate airports solo for the first time in decades. My knees weren't what they used to be after years of standing in school hallways and patrolling football games. My hearing had gotten worse, making it harder to understand airport announcements over the constant noise. And if I'm being honest, the whole experience of modern air travel felt overwhelming without Patricia there to share the burden. I'd arrived at the airport 2 hours early, old habits from my principal days where being prepared for anything was essential. The flight was scheduled to board at 2:30 p.m., and by 2:00 p.m., I was settled in a seat near the gate, reading a book and occasionally glancing up to watch the controlled chaos of airport life. That's when I first noticed her. She was impossible to miss. Mid-40s, blonde hair that looked like she'd just stepped out of an expensive salon, wearing what appeared to be a full designer outfit for a casual Tuesday afternoon flight. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention, it was her behavior. She was on her phone, pacing back and forth near the gate counter, speaking loudly enough for half the waiting area to hear her conversation. "No, Trevor, I specifically told you the meeting was moved to Thursday. How could you possibly schedule the Peterson presentation for the same time?" Her voice had that particular quality that screamed, "I'm more important than everyone else in this vicinity." The gate agent, a young man who looked like he was maybe 25, kept glancing nervously in her direction as her voice got louder and more agitated. "I don't care if Peterson's only in town for 1 day. Figure it out, that's what I pay you for." She ended the call with an aggressive jab at her phone screen, then immediately dialed another number. "Jennifer, it's me. I'm about to board my flight, but I need you to call the airline and upgrade me to first class. I don't care what it costs, I need the legroom and I need to be able to work during the flight." I tried to focus on my book, but she was making it impossible to concentrate. The woman, let's call her Karen because that's exactly what she was, seemed determined to let everyone in the vicinity know how important and busy she was. Other passengers were starting to notice too. An elderly couple sitting across from me kept exchanging looks of annoyance. A young mother with 2 small children was clearly trying to keep her kids from being disturbed by the loud phone calls. But what really caught my attention was when Karen started approaching other passengers near the gate. At 2:15, the gate agent made an announcement: "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin boarding flight 847 to Portland in approximately 15 minutes. Please have your boarding passes ready." That's when Karen made her move. She walked straight up to the gate counter, cutting in front of two passengers who had been waiting to ask questions about their connecting flights. "Excuse me," she said to the gate agent, not really excusing anything. "I need to confirm that my upgrade went through. I should be in first class for this flight." The young gate agent checked his computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Ma'am, I don't see any upgrade requests or confirmations in your file. You're currently assigned to seat 6A, which is a window seat in the main cabin." Karen's face started to redden. "That's impossible. My assistant called specifically to arrange an upgrade." "Check again." "I've checked our system thoroughly, ma'am. There's no record of an upgrade request. However, I'd be happy to see if there are any first-class seats available for purchase." "For purchase?" Karen's voice went up an octave. "I fly with this airline constantly. I shouldn't have to pay extra for decent service." The gate agent maintained his professional composure, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but without a confirmed upgrade, I can't move you to first class. Your current seat assignment is 6A. Karen huffed dramatically and stomped back to her area, immediately getting back on her phone. "Jennifer, what do you mean the upgrade didn't go through? I specifically told you to handle this." At 2:25, the boarding announcement began. "We're now ready to begin boarding flight 847 to Portland. We'll start with our first-class passengers and those needing additional assistance." I was assigned to Group 3, Seat 14CA, middle seat that I wasn't thrilled about but had accepted as part of traveling alone. Patricia always used to book our flights together to ensure we got seats next to each other. Flying solo meant dealing with whatever seat assignments were available. A small group of first-class passengers and elderly travelers began lining up at the gate. The process was orderly and calm, exactly what you'd expect from experienced travelers who understood the system. Then Karen made her move. Despite clearly not being called for boarding yet, she marched right up to the front of the line, squeezing past an elderly gentleman with a walker who was moving slowly toward the gate. "Excuse me," the gentleman said politely. "I believe the line forms back there." Karen barely glanced at him. "I'm first class," she lied smoothly. "Priority boarding." I could see the confusion on the elderly man's face. He looked around uncertainly, clearly wondering if he'd misunderstood the boarding process. The gate agent called out, "Now boarding Group 1, our premium passengers and frequent flyers." A few more passengers joined the line, including Karen, who had positioned herself right at the front despite clearly not belonging there. "Now boarding Group 2, the gate agent announced. I stayed in my seat, knowing I still had a few minutes before my group was called. But I was watching the boarding process with growing irritation as Karen maintained her position at the front of the line, despite obviously not being in the right boarding group. The elderly gentleman with the walker was now behind several people who had joined the line after him, looking confused and slightly defeated. The young mother with small children was struggling to manage her kids and their carry-on bags while waiting her turn. Now boarding Group 3. That was me. I gathered my book and small carry-on bag, stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting for 2 hours, and made my way toward the back of the line. But as I approached, Karen stepped directly in front of me. "Excuse me," I said politely, the way I'd addressed thousands of students and parents over the years. "I believe I was here first." Karen turned around with an expression of complete disdain. "I don't think so. I've been waiting in this line. Ma'am, I watched you cut in front of that elderly gentleman and several other passengers. The line forms back there." I pointed to where new passengers were joining the queue. Karen's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Look, old man, I don't have time for this. I have important business to attend to in Portland, and I need to get on this plane. Maybe you should have gotten here earlier if you wanted a better spot in line." The passengers around us were starting to pay attention. I could see people looking back and forth between Karen and me, clearly recognizing that she was in the wrong but unsure whether to get involved. "I've been sitting over there for 30 minutes, I said, keeping my voice level but firm. "I saw you cut in line, and it's not fair to the other passengers who have been waiting their turn." Karen stepped closer to me, invading my personal space in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. At 64, I wasn't easily intimidated, especially by someone throwing a tantrum. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice low and threatening. "I paid good money for this flight, I have priority boarding, and I'm getting on this plane first. If you have a problem with that, Take it up with the gate agent. And that's when I reached into my bag and everything changed. What I pulled out was my phone, but not to make a call or send a text. I opened the camera app and took a clear photo of Karen's boarding pass, which she was holding in her hand as she argued with me. "What are you doing?" she demanded, trying to cover her boarding pass. "Just documenting the situation," I said calmly. "Including your seat assignment, which I can clearly see is 6A, Group 3, just like mine." Karen's face went pale. She hadn't realized I could see her boarding pass information. "You have no right to take my picture," she sputtered. "Actually, we're in a public place, so I have every right to document disruptive behavior," I replied, drawing on decades of dealing with difficult parents and students. "And what I've documented is that you cut in line, claim to have priority boarding when you don't, and are currently in violation of basic boarding etiquette." The gate agent had noticed the commotion and was walking over. "Is there a problem here, folks?" "Yes," I said before Karen could respond. "This passenger cut in front of multiple people in the boarding line and is claiming to have priority boarding. I have a photo of her boarding pass showing she's assigned to Group 3, same as me." Karen immediately launched into her defense. "This man is harassing me. He took my picture without permission and is causing a scene." The gate agent looked tired. It was clear this wasn't his first boarding dispute of the day. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass, please?" Karen reluctantly handed it over. The gate agent studied it for a moment, then looked at the line. "Ma'am, you're assigned to Group 3, and you're currently standing with Group 1 passengers. I'm going to need you to move to the back of the line where Group 3 passengers are boarding." "This is ridiculous," Karen shrieked. "I demand to speak to your supervisor." "My supervisor is on another flight right now," the gate agent said patiently. "But I'd be happy to document your complaint. In the meantime, please step to the back of the line so we can continue boarding." Karen looked around wildly, as if expecting support from other passengers. Instead, she found dozens of people staring at her with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright hostility. "Fine," she said dramatically. "But I'm reporting this entire airline for discrimination and poor customer service." She stomped to the back of the line, muttering loudly about incompetent employees and terrible service. As the line started moving again, I found myself standing next to the elderly gentleman with the walker whom Karen had originally cut in front of. "Thank you for speaking up," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything." "People like that count on others staying quiet," I replied. "Sometimes you have to stand up to bullying, even when you'd rather just keep the peace." As we slowly made our way toward the gate, I could hear Karen behind us, still complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. "Can you believe the nerve of that old man? Taking pictures of me like some kind of stalker." And the gate agent completely took his side without even hearing my story. What Karen didn't realize was that I was listening to every word and forming a plan. You see, 38 years as a high school principal teaches you a lot about human behavior. You learn to recognize patterns, anticipate problems, and sometimes, when necessary, let natural consequences teach lessons that words cannot. And Karen was about to learn a very important lesson about the consequences of entitled behavior. When I reached the gate agent, I handed him my boarding pass and ID. As he scanned my pass, I said quietly, "That passenger who was causing trouble. You might want to keep an eye on her boarding pass when she gets on the plane." The gate agent looked puzzled. "Why's that?" I showed him the photo I'd taken on my phone. "Her seat assignment is 6A. I have a feeling she's going to try to sit somewhere else and cause problems for your flight crew." The gate agent studied the photo, then looked back at me with understanding dawning in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. I'll make sure to alert the flight attendants." I made my way down the jetway and onto the plane, where I was greeted by a friendly flight attendant named Marcus. "Welcome aboard," he said with a professional smile. "Seat 14C? Actually," I said, lowering my voice, "I wanted to mention something. There's a passenger boarding behind me who was causing problems at the gate cutting in line, claiming she had priority boarding when she didn't." The gate agent took a photo of her boarding pass, which shows she's assigned to seat 6A. "I suspect she might try to sit in a different seat or cause problems." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for the heads up. We appreciate passengers who help us maintain order." I made my way to the middle of the plane, toward my assigned seat in row 14. But as I passed row 6, I noticed something interesting. Seat 6A was currently empty, and the passenger in 6B was an elderly woman who looked like she could use some peace and quiet during the flight. An idea formed in my mind. A slightly mischievous idea that would have made Patricia laugh out loud. Instead of continuing to my assigned seat, I stopped at row 6 and placed my carry-on bag in the overhead compartment directly above seat 6A. Then, I sat down in Karen's window seat. The elderly woman in 6B looked at me with surprise. "Excuse me, but I think someone else is supposed to be sitting there." "Oh, they'll be along shortly," I said with a smile. "Don't worry, this will all work out perfectly." About 10 minutes later, I heard a commotion from the front of the plane. Karen's voice was getting louder and more agitated as she made her way down the aisle. "Excuse me, coming through. I have an important call to make before takeoff." She was pushing past other passengers who were still getting settled, clearly in a hurry to claim what she assumed would be a better seat than her assigned 6A. But when she reached row 14, my actual assigned seat, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Excuse me," she said to the passenger who had taken my middle seat, a young man who looked like a college student. "You're in my seat." The young man looked confused and checked his boarding pass. "No, ma'am, I'm in 14C, that's what my boarding pass says." Karen pulled out her boarding pass and stared at it in confusion. "But, this says 6A, that can't be right. I specifically requested an aisle seat in the back of the plane." "Ma'am," said the young man patiently, 6A is a window seat near the front of the plane. You're about 8 rows away from your actual seat." Karen looked around wildly, as if the airplane seating chart would somehow rearrange itself to accommodate her confusion. "This is impossible," she muttered, stomping back toward the front of the plane. I watched in my peripheral vision as Karen approached row 6. I was reading my book, trying to look completely innocent, when I heard her voice right behind me. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." I looked up from my book with an expression of polite confusion. "I'm sorry, what? You're in my seat," Karen repeated, her voice getting shriller. "That's 6A, and that's my assigned seat." I looked at my boarding pass, the one that clearly showed 14C, and then looked back at her with the most innocent expression I could muster. "Ma'am, I think you're confused. This is my assigned seat." Karen's face was turning red. "No, I just checked my boarding pass. You're that old man from the gate who was taking pictures of me. You followed me onto this plane and stole my seat." The elderly woman in 6B was watching this exchange with wide eyes. Other passengers were starting to turn around to see what the commotion was about. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "I'm sitting in my assigned seat, just like every other passenger on this plane. If you think there's been some kind of mistake with your seat assignment, I suggest you speak to one of the flight attendants." And that's when Marcus, the flight attendant I'd spoken to earlier, appeared in the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew exactly what was happening. "Yes," Karen shrieked. "This man stole my seat. He was harassing me at the gate, and now he's stolen my seat assignment." Marcus looked at me with barely concealed amusement. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass, please?" I handed over my boarding pass, which clearly showed seat 14C. Marcus examined it carefully, then looked back at Karen. "Ma'am, this passenger is not in your seat. His boarding pass shows 14C. Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Karen handed over her boarding pass, her hands shaking slightly with rage. Marcus studied it, then looked back at her. "Ma'am, your assigned seat is 6A. This is 6A. This passenger is not in your seat because this is not his seat." The whole exchange was getting more confusing by the minute, and I could see that Marcus was starting to piece together what was actually happening. "Wait," Marcus said slowly, looking back at my boarding pass, then at the seat I was occupying. "Sir, if your assigned seat is 14C, why are you sitting in 6A? I looked up at him with the most innocent expression I could manage. "Oh, I'm sorry. I must have misread my boarding pass. These old eyes aren't what they used to be." I made a show of studying my boarding pass again, squinting at the numbers. "You're absolutely right. I'm in the wrong seat. My apologies." I started to gather my things, moving slowly and deliberately. Karen was practically vibrating with rage as she waited for me to vacate her seat. "It's about time," she muttered under her breath. But Marcus held up his hand. "Actually, sir, before you move, I need to clarify something." "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, "when you boarded this aircraft, did you go directly to your assigned seat?" Karen hesitated. Well, I looked for my seat, yes. That's not what I asked, Marcus said firmly. Did you go directly to seat 6A when you boarded the plane? I was trying to find a better seat, Karen admitted. My assistant was supposed to arrange an upgrade, and when it didn't go through, I thought maybe I could find an empty seat with more legroom. Marcus nodded slowly. So you attempted to sit in a seat that wasn't assigned to you, couldn't find one that was available, and then came back to claim your original seat assignment? Yes, but this man was in my seat. Karen said desperately. Actually, Marcus said, pulling out a small tablet, this passenger alerted us when he boarded that you might try to sit in a different seat than your assignment. He specifically told us you were assigned to 6A and that we should keep an eye out for boarding pass issues. Karen's mouth fell open. He what? Marcus smiled. Sir, thank you for the heads up. It helped us track this passenger's movements throughout the boarding process. The elderly woman in seat 6B was now openly chuckling. Other passengers were watching the drama unfold with expressions of delight. So let me understand this correctly, Marcus continued. You cut in line during boarding, lied about having priority boarding, attempted to sit in unauthorized seats, and are now accusing another passenger of stealing your seat when he was actually helping us monitor your disruptive behavior. Karen looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route. This is entrapment. You can't do this. Ma'am, Marcus said, his professional demeanor never wavering. No one entrapped you. You made a series of choices that violated airline boarding policies and disrupted other passengers' travel experience. This passenger simply alerted us to potential problems and then demonstrated exactly why we needed to be concerned. He paused, looking around the cabin where dozens of passengers were now openly watching the confrontation. Now, I'm going to give you two options. Option 1, you can take your assigned seat, buckle your seatbelt, and behave appropriately for the remainder of this flight. Option 2, I can have you removed from this aircraft and you can take the next available flight. Karen's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. You can't remove me from this plane. I paid for my ticket. Actually, ma'am, we can remove any passenger who disrupts the boarding process, lies to airline personnel, or creates a hostile environment for other travelers. What's it going to be? The cabin was dead silent except for the hum of the airplane's systems. Every passenger was waiting to see what would happen next. Karen looked around at all the faces staring at her, realizing that she had absolutely no support from anyone on the plane. Her shoulders sagged slightly as the fight went out of her. Fine, she said quietly. I'll take my seat. I slowly gathered my belongings and stood up, offering Karen a polite smile. Thank you for your patience, ma'am. I hope you enjoy your flight. As I made my way back to my actual assigned seat in row 14, I could hear scattered applause from other passengers. The young man in 14C moved back to his original seat, grinning from ear to ear. That was amazing, he whispered as I sat down. How did you know she would try to sit somewhere else? I smiled. 38 years as a high school principal teaches you a lot about entitled behavior. Sometimes the best way to address it is to let people face the natural consequences of their choices. The rest of the flight was peaceful and uneventful. Karen sat quietly in her window seat, not making a single phone call or complaint for the entire 3-hour journey. The elderly woman next to her struck up a pleasant conversation about their grandchildren, and by the time we landed in Portland, Karen was actually smiling and laughing at something her seatmate had said. Marcus stopped by my seat during the flight to thank me again. You know, we get passengers like that more often than you'd think. People who think paying for a ticket entitles them to ignore basic courtesy and airline policies. It's refreshing to meet someone who understands how to handle the situation appropriately. It's all about consequences, I told him. In education, we call it natural consequences, letting people learn from the results of their own choices rather than just lecturing them about right and wrong. Well, your natural consequence was perfect, Marcus said with a grin. She got to experience exactly what it feels like to have someone else disrupt her plans, and she learned that actions have repercussions. When we landed in Portland, Karen was actually one of the first passengers to stand up and help other people get their luggage from the overhead compartments. The transformation was remarkable. As I was deplaning, she caught up with me in the jetway. Excuse me, she said, her voice much softer than it had been at the gate. I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. I was having a really stressful day, but that's no excuse for taking it out on other passengers. I was genuinely surprised by her apology. I appreciate that. It takes character to admit when we're wrong. I've been thinking about what happened during the flight, she continued. And I realized that you could have handled that situation in a lot of different ways. You could have made me look foolish or gotten me thrown off the plane. Instead, you just let me learn from my own mistakes. I smiled. Sometimes that's the most effective teaching method. Are you a teacher? She asked. Was. High school principal for 38 years. Retired last year. Karen nodded thoughtfully. That explains a lot. You handled that situation like someone who's dealt with difficult people before. Everyone has bad days, I said gently. The measure of a person is what they do when they realize they've been wrong. As I walked through the Portland airport toward baggage claim, I thought about Patricia and how much she would have enjoyed hearing about this adventure. She always said I had a talent for dealing with difficult people, but she also worried that I was sometimes too patient with bad behavior. Robert, she used to say, her hazel eyes twinkling with that mix of affection and gentle reproach that I'd grown to love over our 43 years of marriage, sometimes being kind means letting people face the consequences of their choices. You can't protect everyone from learning hard lessons. Patricia had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things, a clarity of vision that I'd always admired but never quite managed to emulate. She was the one who would politely but firmly tell the neighbor when their music was too loud, who would send back undercooked food at restaurants without a second thought, who would correct the grocery store clerk when they'd been short change. Not because she enjoyed confrontation, quite the opposite, but because she understood that boundaries weren't walls built to keep people out, they were guideposts that helped everyone navigate life more smoothly. I, on the other hand, had spent most of my adult life avoiding conflict, smoothing over rough edges, finding ways to accommodate everyone's needs even when it meant sacrificing my own comfort or principles. It wasn't that I was weak. Patricia never would have fallen in love with a weak man, but rather that I believed deeply in the power of kindness to transform difficult situations. Sometimes it worked. Often, though, my patience was mistaken for permission, my accommodation taken as invitation to push boundaries even further. She would have laughed at the story of Karen and the seat switching, her shoulders shaking with that silent mirth that always made her eyes crinkle at the corners. But she also would have been proud that I stood up for the elderly gentleman who got cut in line and helped maintain order during a chaotic boarding process. Finally, she might have said, "You're learning that kindness isn't the same thing as being a doormat." The Portland airport felt different on this return journey than it had during my arrival 3 days earlier. Then, I'd been nervous, uncertain, clutching my boarding pass like a lifeline and checking my watch every few minutes. The trip to see my old college roommate had been my first solo adventure in decades, the first time I'd traveled anywhere without Patricia's steady presence beside me, her careful attention to details I might overlook, her gentle but insistent way of ensuring I didn't forget important things like medication or charging cables or the phone number of our hotel. Now, walking through the same terminal, I felt different. Not completely transformed. I wasn't naive enough to think one airplane encounter could undo a lifetime of ingrained habits, but somehow more solid, more present in my own skin. The confidence wasn't flashy or obvious, it was quiet, like the difference between a candle and a steady pilot light. Small, but essential. My daughter Lisa was waiting for me at baggage claim, just like Patricia used to do when she'd pick me up from business trips. The resemblance between them had grown stronger over the years, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of tilting her head slightly when she was listening intently, the same unconscious habit of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. Seeing Lisa always brought a complex mix of comfort and heartache, the joy of recognizing Patricia's best qualities living on in our daughter mingled with the sharp awareness of all the things Patricia would never see or experience. "Dad, how was your flight? Any interesting stories?" Lisa's voice carried that particular tone adult children use when they're trying to gauge their parents' emotional state without being too obvious about it. I recognized it because I'd used the same tone with my own father in his final years, that careful balance between genuine interest and protective vigilance. I grinned as I hugged her, feeling for the first time in months like I actually had something worth sharing. "Oh, you could say that. Let me tell you about this passenger who learned a very important lesson about airplane etiquette." As we walked toward her car, navigating the familiar maze of Portland's parking garage, I told Lisa the whole story. I found myself embellishing certain details, not lying, exactly, but allowing my natural storytelling instincts to polish the narrative until it gleamed. I described Karen's expression when she realized I wasn't going to simply acquiesce to her demands. The way the flight attendant's professional smile had turned genuine when she understood what was happening. The small nod of approval from the elderly gentleman I'd helped earlier. Lisa laughed until tears were running down her cheeks, one hand pressed against the car door for support. "Dad, I can't believe you actually sat in her seat. That's so unlike you." And she was right, it was unlike me, or at least unlike the version of me that had existed before Patricia's death. That Robert would have apologized profusely, gathered his belongings, and shuffled off to find his actual seat, probably spending the rest of the flight feeling vaguely guilty about the inconvenience he'd supposedly caused. This Robert, the one who was still emerging, still figuring out who he might become, had found a different response. "Well," I said, buckling my seatbelt as Lisa started the engine, "your mother always said retirement was a time to try new things." It wasn't entirely true. Patricia had actually said that about learning to use the computer, or taking up watercolor painting, or finally reading all those books that had been gathering dust on our shelves. She'd never specifically encouraged me to become more assertive in my interactions with strangers. But I knew, with the kind of deep certainty that comes from decades of shared life, that she would have approved of this particular growth. That evening, as I sat in Lisa's guest room looking through photos of Patricia on my phone, I thought about how much can change in a single day. The pictures told the story of our life together: early photos from our dating years, when her hair was long and my face was unlined, wedding photos where we both looked impossibly young and hopeful, vacation pictures from trips to places whose names now carried the weight of memory, family photos with Lisa at various stages of childhood and adolescence, and finally, the more recent ones, where Patricia's illness had begun to show in her eyes even when she was smiling. I'd started the morning nervous about traveling alone for the first time in decades, my stomach tight with anxiety about navigating airports and rental cars and hotel check-ins without Patricia's quiet competence to rely on. I was ending it with a great story, a renewed confidence in my ability to handle difficult situations, and a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it just requires the wisdom to let people learn from their own choices. The lesson extended beyond airplane etiquette, beyond the specific interaction with Karen and her entitled assumptions about how the world should bend to accommodate her preferences. It was about the broader principle that Patricia had tried to teach me throughout our marriage, that true kindness sometimes means allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their behavior, that enabling poor choices doesn't actually help anyone grow or learn. And sometimes, when someone cuts in line and disrupts everyone else's day, the most satisfying response is simply to give them exactly what they've earned, a perfect demonstration of how it feels when someone else doesn't follow the rules. That's a lesson worth learning, whether you're at 30,000 feet or standing on solid ground. It's a lesson about boundaries and consequences, about the difference between kindness and capitulation, about the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let others diminish it. As I turned off the light and settled into the unfamiliar bed, I felt Patricia's presence not as the sharp ache of loss that had dominated the past year, but as something warmer and more sustaining: the knowledge that the best parts of our relationship would continue to guide and shape me long after her physical presence was gone. She'd always believed I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. Maybe, finally, I was beginning to believe it too.